Well, a few years ago, WWJD was a very popular saying. What would Jesus do? It seems kind of obvious. You have a problem, you ask what would Jesus do, and the problem's solved. But I was never really a big fan of WWJD because I thought too many times WWJD became, what would I like Jesus to do? Or more difficultly, what would I do that I want Jesus to affirm? But it's more complicated than that. What would Jesus do? It's a difficult question because we never really know what Jesus was going to do. The apostles were always perplexed by what Jesus was doing. Repeatedly were said the apostles were amazed. They were confused. They were perplexed. The story of the woman caught in adultery. Who would have expected Jesus to sit down on the ground and start writing letters? Nobody expected that. We could go through the Gospels and we see again and again, we never know exactly what Jesus is going to do. So what would Jesus do? We're not really sure. The more important part of the question has to do with Jesus himself. The question is, who is Jesus? In Matthew 16, Jesus asks his apostles, he says, who do people say that I am? And they say, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, some say Jeremiah or the prophets. And then Jesus says, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answers correctly. Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus affirms Peter and says, you have answered correctly. And then he goes and says, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. And he praises him. But within a few minutes, Jesus is saying to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are thinking in man's terms and not in God's. And what has led to that turn? How does Peter change so quickly? He changes because he doesn't accept the suffering that Jesus is going to have to go through. Jesus tells the disciples about what is going to happen to him. He's going to go to Jerusalem and suffer. And Peter doesn't want that. And so very quickly we get the understanding that Peter doesn't understand who Jesus is or what Jesus is about. Even in this Easter season, as we celebrate the resurrected Lord, we were reminded of suffering. To know Jesus is to deal with suffering. In the second reading today, Peter tells us, if you are patient when you suffer for doing what is good, this is a grace before God. For this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you. Suffering is integral to who Jesus and his followers are. And what is Jesus' response to suffering? It says, when he was insulted, he returned no insult. When he suffered, he did not threaten. Instead, he handed himself over to the one who judges justly. We might find this focus on suffering difficult to accept. In a recent movie called Silence, Martin Scorsese's movie of the Japanese Catholic novelist Shusaku Endo's novel, it's a long reflection on suffering and the role of Jesus. Why does God allow suffering? Why does God allow those who are faithful servants to him suffer? Why does God remain silent in the face of this suffering? The story takes place in 17th century Japan, and it's a time in which the Japanese government has banned Christianity. It's outlawed Christianity and has chased all the priests out of Japan. And it has started a very aggressive persecution of the remaining Christians. To root out what they call the hidden Christians, they developed this process where they made each peasant step on the face of Jesus as to renounce the faith. And so they would bring out the face and they put it in front of them and they would have to step on it. Well, 2 Jesuits in Europe learned that one of their mentors had stayed in Japan, and the rumor was that he had renounced the faith. So they decided to go in and discover what had happened to their mentor, this Jesuit. They sneak into Japan and they begin to minister to the hidden Christians. And what they see is people who have incredible faith, go through all sorts of hardships, risk all sorts of dangers, and yet they are facing this incredible persecution. They're incredibly loyal, but now they face repeated threats of death and other sorts of torture. And the one priest begins to ask, why does God allow this suffering? Why does he allow his faithful ones to experience this? And he says that God remains silent in the face of this suffering. As the story goes on, one of the priests is captured, and the suffering that he witnesses grows worse. The Christians are tortured and put through all sorts of terrible ordeals. And the Japanese leaders then come up with a brilliant scheme. They tell the priest that if he will renounce the faith, they will stop the persecution of the other Christians. They will stop the torture. And then they bring up the question, what would Jesus do? One of the Japanese leaders says to the priest, "You say that your God is love. Surely he would intercede for these people who are suffering right now. He would renounce the faith to save these people from going through further torture." And this puts the priest through a tremendous amount of anguish. As he goes through this questioning, he cries out at one point and he says, "Lord, it is now that you should break the silence. You must not remain silent. Prove that you are justice, that you are goodness, that you are love. You must say something to show the world that you are the august one." But God remains silent, and the persecution continues. The priest continues to struggle with this, and finally he comes to the conclusion that the only option for him to do is to renounce the faith by stepping on the cross, stepping on the face of Jesus. And as he approaches this momentous decision, he looks at the face on where he has to step on. It's a face that he's loved his entire life. And as he goes to step on it, the face speaks to him. Jesus speaks to him. And this is what Jesus says. Jesus says, "Trample, trample. I more than anyone know of the pain in your foot. Trample. It was to be trampled on by men that I was born into this world. It was to share men's pain that I carried my cross." In the second reading today, Peter echoes that simply with, "By his wounds you have been healed." We believe that in the midst of all of our suffering, of all of our travails, of all of our problems, Jesus is with us, sharing in that suffering. Jesus is there, sustaining us, loving us, being with us. He may not remove the suffering, but he is there present with us. That is the reason why he came, to be with us in our suffering. What would Jesus do? What will we do? We are called to place ourselves with those who suffer in this world, the outcasts, the poor, the sick, the sorrowing, all of those who feel that this life offers nothing but suffering. We are called to place ourselves with them, to share their suffering. Like Jesus, we deliver ourselves and our suffering into the hands of the one who judges justly. Jesus shares our suffering, and he suffers with us. At the end of the story, the priest prays to Jesus, and he says, "Lord, I resented your silence." And Jesus answers him, "I was not silent. I suffered beside you." What would Jesus do? What will we do? When he was insulted, he returned no insult. When he suffered, he did not threaten. Instead, he handed himself over to the one who judges justly. By his wounds, we have been healed.